Recording.
All right, well, good to see everybody here this morning. Good to have you joining us online if you're joining us. You've tuned in. Nice to have you along. We're, you might notice we're in a different little setting here. Just moved next door, just maybe a little more convenient since just a couple of us this morning. And wanted to start off by talking about some additions to our prayer list. So one of the fellows that I've been working for, doing some work for us over this house, is dealing with cancer. And you try to encourage people to try different things, but a lot of people, when you're facing that, they do what they think is best. And he's going. Got him signed up
for radiation.
The doctor's got him signed up for 8 weeks of radiation, which is probably going to kill him. Unfortunately, he's an elderly man, but we want to lift Calvin up in prayer.
And my sister, because they want her to do radiation for the cancer she's got.
Yeah, that's it.
Patty.
So,
she's the lymphoma that they were treating her for with chemo is gone, but they say there's another tumor that's wrapped around her internal organs and radiation. Just
to go on record, I mean, if people, it's easy to go to a physician and go through the standard thing, which is where most of them are going to direct you, but just to go on record and state that there are a lot of better alternatives to give your body a fighting chance than to radiate it or to chemo it. Which is kind of a shotgun approach, because you're taking something that's going to poison your whole system to try to get rid of something that is causing problems.
And the cancer is actually your body's way of trying to get rid of something.
The cancer is actually kind of a self-defense mechanism to try to wall off something that has been maybe an ongoing issue that you hadn't dealt with. And,
Scott says Shabbat Shalom.
So it's how you deal with it. It's how you deal with it. But anyway, prayer, obviously, prayer helps as an encouragement for folks. And of course, God can intervene in any situation and make something go away with just the snap of a finger, the blink of an eye. But so we want to pray for him and his wife. And of course, Rose's sister and her family. Even one of the fellows that stays there, Hesh, he had like some sunstroke yesterday, so he's probably still feeling the effects of that. And from talking to Elijah here, it just seems like there are lots of folks that we know that we've kind of come in contact with recently that are dealing with a lot of health challenges. So
this getting older stuff isn't much fun.
Yeah, and it's the environment that we live in too. We live in such a rush, hurry society that puts a lot of extra stress and strain on the immune system. Certainly the diets and the environmental factors, a lot of stress and strain on the immune system. So prayer, I think, really is a key remedy in your overall health. So we want to encourage folks out there to be praying for others, and of course be praying for yourself as well. You need to do that.
Also, continue to pray for the political issues that are going on in the country. And so much stuff happening right now, it's too hard to even keep track of it anymore.
Politically, economically, socially, environmentally. I mean, you could just go down a whole list of factors that will culminate. In the reason why we're laughing is because I think one of our sons is dropping off a tractor here later today. It sounds like it might be it, but anyway. So maybe we can go ahead and get prayer out of the way before we get totally interrupted here with dogs barking and noises of machinery. So let's go ahead and lead Father, we want to thank you so much for who you are, and you promised to take such good care of us, and you certainly have. You afford to us life and health and strength. We want to thank you for that. But there are many that we know that we've come in contact with that are facing tremendous challenges health-wise. And we're just praying, Lord, that you draw near to them. People try their best to deal with these things, and we know that they take recommendations from physicians, and they have confidence in other people and professionals, but we know that you're a God who can really make things happen, and so we just want to leave them in your capable hands. So we lift up Calvin, we lift up Patty and Hesh and the rest of the people that we've talked about. So we lift them up to you. We have faith, Lord, that you will help them. If nothing else, we pray that your Spirit will encourage them, strengthen them, give them a peace to know that they're in your hands. We also, Lord, want to pray for our country and our leaders. We want to pray that you will give us the time that we need to take a message of salvation, the full gospel message to our community and to the people that we know and love. And we know, Lord, that time is running out, time is of the essence, and so we're asking that you would fit us up and that you would use us to set about a course that would be encouragement to all of our friends and loved ones. Bless our time together here today as we open your word. We pray your Spirit will be here to guide and direct. And we ask these mercies in Jesus' wonderful name. Please bless all those who are watching and joining us online at different times. We pray, Lord, that they'll receive the blessing that you have stored up for us. In Jesus' name we ask. Amen. Just in time.
I'm assuming Melissa's coming. Yep.
Yes, we'll turn by.
She's bringing the tractor up here.
Yeah. So if you hear the delightful roar, hum of, and then you're going to hear some barking that's going to ensue. That's
barking is visible.
yeah.
Our watchdog member.
She seems to be okay right now.
She's all right. She doesn't know it's Timmy.
Yeah. Okay. Just,
If she knew it was Timmy, that would be a different
and of course, we
story.
had all the excitement we could stand this morning with in Floyd County here. One day a year they do a tractor run where you'll have about 100 tractors roll through the streets.
As if that wasn't commonplace anyways.
Yeah, it's just
we need a whole day for it.
We don't usually have 100 of them at one time.
Yeah,
No.
so
We're constantly
So we've
being
been-
bombarded
we've
with
already been
ones in the field.
had a measure of excitement this morning for that, watching that happen. At any rate, I want to just chat a little bit. Rose mentioned a news article that had come out this past week about you guys talked about the hailstones.
Oh yes.
Stop.
Intruder alert. Isn't that pitiful? Yeah, they said Colorado this month set a record for the biggest hailstones,
Really?
5.5 inches.
5.5
They
inches.
said these were stones that were heavy enough, if they hit you, they could kill you. Could definitely affect livestock and things like that.
No.
Okay, so you see we're good.
All right. Fun time for Dad this weekend.
Oh yes.
Digging in the dirt in the machine.
Oh yeah. Give this man a digger and he's a happy
Oh
camper.
yeah. Well,
Gets to move that ground.
Beach shoveling.
Oh yeah. That's the king. Beach shoveling. So.
No.
Hey, listen, man. I'm down in my core. I'm an earth mover, right?
Did you let him know about the tomatoes out there if he wanted some?
No.
Is he out that way?
No, he.
Went down that way.
I'm an earth mover, right? I mean, isn't that what the gospel is? Really, an earth mover. I want to move the earth. I want to move the people of the earth.
Yeah, sort of.
So, anyway, Mom was mentioning the
Record hailstones.
record hailstones.
They
Just
say
a
nothing
little
yet.
bit of foretaste. Yeah, just a little foretaste of coming events that the Book of Revelation talks about.
Too much excitement for the
Well,
phone.
that's kind of the interesting thing, I think, is like, we're starting to see things pick up to, starting to build. We're getting earthquakes everywhere, volcanoes everywhere. Like, it seems like stuff is destabilizing at a phenomenal rate, or maybe it's just because our capacity to know about them has increased so dramatically.
Yeah, well, Scripture says, when you see all of these things come about,
You gonna close that
and,
curtain?
No.
know that the
He's gone.
time
She
is
just
drawing
checking to see where he
nigh.
is.
Yeah,
She
looks
knows
like
he's
the,
here.
yeah, she looks like the RCA
Little sentinel
control
dog.
sentinel there.
By the way, the correction on the hailstone size, it was 4.83 inches.
Okay.
They said it was the largest hailstone on record.
Some had melted off, huh? It started to melt. I mean, obviously, they're only measuring it after it hits the ground.
This was 2 days ago, Tuesday.
I mean, you can only measure it after it hits the ground, after
Right.
you collect it.
Well, but then that's already pretty close to 5 inches, as it is. It's the size of a
There's a picture of a
softball.
softball.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they're about the size of a softball. Yeah, I mean, those coming down, if that hits you in the head.
Oh boy, you would be like
Little crack
Steve
in
and I
the
were
skull.
talking about it. It's been like being stoned.
Yeah.
It's like
And
the
if
whole
you talk
community
about
would be
you talk
stoned.
about at the end having hailstones the weight of a talent. A talent weighed about 50 pounds.
Maybe like a
5 gallon
drywall,
bucket.
5-gallon bucket of drywall coming down.
Yeah, that put holes through your roof.
Get to the chopper. Yeah. I don't know.
Well, you would have to be. Listen, you would have to be in order to survive something like that. You
In
would
a
have to be
cave.
in a cave. You'd have to be
You would.
underground.
I mean, you could theoretically build a house strong enough. You don't think so?
No, not. Hey,
That'd be
listen,
like cannon fire bombarding your house.
Yeah.
You'd have to build a stone house.
That's what I'm saying.
Even that
Like, nice
eventually
concrete
would.
roof.
Even a stone, something with slate and all that would.
No, not slate, like a concrete bunker, like.
It's gonna tear it up.
Like a bunker.
Yeah.
Tear it up. Now, if you had a
Bunker busting
steel,
hailstones.
if you had steel, maybe a steel structure. I mean, thick steel plate.
Yeah.
You might be able to do.
Might get a few dents or
survive.
something, like tank armor
Yeah.
for your
tank
roof.
armor, yeah. So, at any rate,
Man, it's like, man, Elijah, why are you building that roof so sturdy? You're
yeah.
expecting hailstones that weigh about 50 pounds, so.
And some people say that the talent that's 100 pounds, not 50. So but 50 or 100 is kind of a moot point there.
Yeah.
It's gonna
100's gonna completely destroy, 50's gonna.
It's gonna pummel everything,
Back when I was in church
50's
school,
gonna kill anything it hits.
they did an experiment with it, and the boys decided that was going to be their demonstration. Was they were going to take that particular plague,
and
and so they went to
froze
the factory, the food factory where we worked, and they froze these 5-gallon buckets full of water, and then they filmed dropping them off the balcony from the boys' dorm. There's some pretty serious holes in the ground.
yeah, I mean,
Just busted the concrete at the bottom.
if you have it coming down like raindrops, like hail falls. I mean, it's gonna delimb trees.
It's gonna take down some
It's
trees.
gonna take
Kill
down
crops.
trees. Gonna kill anything that's out there, cattle, animals.
Of course, there's preceding plagues too, right? That would obviously annihilate anything else that's left.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, not a good situation, and God's people are going to have to be protected, and He obviously will set a shield over them to protect them.
Yeah, I mean, just like how Israel wasn't affected by the plagues in Egypt. I think
Right. Exactly.
hailstones will be everywhere, but
Yeah.
everywhere but your place.
Yeah. So.
It'll be interesting.
All right. So anything else? And there are probably other things that were in the
There
news.
really wasn't any significant, weather-related last day event type of news that I saw.
Well, the other thing is there seemed to have been a period of time after July where the chemtrails had been suspended. And we were hearing all this, scuttlebutt about Trump suspending the chemtrail stuff. And then about a month later, this month, all of a sudden we see a report where, Harvard University or one of the universities is going to start studying, whether or not they can shield us from the heat of the sun. And so, like right away, I mean, I took a picture of it the other day. Right away, the sky starts filling up again with chemtrails, because now they've come out openly and said, "Oh yeah, we're going to study this and
We're going to try to block out the sun.
We're going to try to block out the sun and see what happens."
Trying to create nuclear winter in places.
Yeah, I mean, as if they haven't been doing it for the last 50 years. You know, but the sky, you know, was full of chemtrails. I mean, almost immediately after the report, so they just started going crazy again.
India, they've been experimenting for the month of July with biometric payment systems. It means it's totally cashless. And they said in July they did more than 200 million transactions.
Yeah.
Just
with this biometric authentication.
That's the same thing.
So, like,
that's the same thing as like Apple Pay, where you just wave your phone in front of it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's not anything new. I mean, biometric just means it scans your face and you just pay that way.
Right.
Or you scan your fingerprint.
Or your fingerprint or something. Yeah.
What do you think of a country like India doing that?
Yeah, technology has.
It's biometric payment cards that they're using.
Card.
And
So,
the CEO of Bank of America says, we want a cashless society.
Where's they barely got any
yeah,
cash
and we've
savings.
been actually talking about that for over 20 years. We've been talking about that because there have been rumblings about cashless, about different money
Economic
coming
collapse.
out, you know, different.
Well, people want cashless because like
I mean,
the dollar
the technology is there to go cashless, and you might as well have a world cashless system, right? Where it's all tied together.
Well, what's interesting is this one article on this shows the different places where they're testing this cashless using the cell phones primarily.
Right.
Somalia, Africa, a lot of third world countries that they're testing this out in.
And in these countries, which we would consider, you say third world.
Well,
Um,
Somalia is definitely third world.
they
China's doing it. Japan is doing it. It's not third world, but
Some of the places that I've visited, like in Turkey and Egypt and whatnot, and even through Africa, some places, you would think they're third world countries and whatnot, but everybody's got a satellite dish and a cell phone. I mean, that is just commonplace.
I think that's where the governments have stepped in, and they've pushed this and made it affordable for everybody to get this technology in their homes.
I know Bill Gates' company has been huge in that
Right.
endeavor and allowing everybody to have access to the internet. And
Right.
I was
which
trying
is
to figure
both
out years
blessing and
ago
curse.
why the federal government was doing all kinds of programs to push high-speed internet for rural America. I thought, why does rural America need high-speed internet? I mean, what we've got now is great, you know, but why were they pushing for all of these rural areas to get access to high speed? Most of the towns didn't have high-speed internet unless they had cable.
Mhm.
Anyway, technology. You have to talk about technology more, a little bit more, maybe in the following weeks. But there's no question that's going to play a role in. I mean, you would think it would be great to promote the gospel, and you can do that to promote the gospel, but it's also going to play a role in targeting, being able to target God's people and suppress them, and to eventually persecute them.
I mean, there's obviously already moves to do that with people suppressing information on the internet about all sorts of different subjects.
Conservative aspect. All right, so we want to go ahead and kick back into studying Galatians. We're in chapter 2. And let's just go ahead and open our Bibles there. And Galatians is really a time where, dealing with a couple of different issues, and it's really, the book of Galatians surrounds a time where Paul is going to go up to Jerusalem for the council up there, be his last trip up there.
It's also one of the most prominent books that evangelicals use to try to defend the concept that the law was done away with.
Right.
Yeah, I looked up some studies last night, just a few of them, and all of them were like talking about how this is where Paul was saying that the law was obsolete and it was temporary. And I was like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard.
Sure. Yeah. And
How can anything eternal be temporary?
And if Paul were here himself and you made that kind of a statement, he would say, well, what are you talking about? There's no way I was trying to get that.
Yeah, it's just such a huge misunderstanding of Paul's letters that it's just so stupid to me.
Yeah.
Like it's just a massive misunderstanding.
Let's just go ahead and read through the chapter, and then we'll go back and kind of
Where are you
unpack it a
reading
little bit.
from?
Chapter 2.
Galatians 2.
Okay.
Galatians 2. It says the 14 years after I went up again to Jerusalem.
2 what? Just 2?
Chapter 2.
Chapter 2, yeah, just starting the one. It says, then 14 years after I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas and took Titus with me also. And I went up by revelation and communicated unto them that gospel which I preached among the Gentiles, but privately to them which were of reputation, lest by any means I should run or had run in vain. And also I will mention, I read this in the New American Standard version last night, and it seemed to be a lot clearer in terms of the intent as compared to the King James version here, which I'm sharing.
I can bring that out if you want.
It says, but neither Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised, and that because of false brethren, unawares brought in, who came in privately to spy out our liberty, which we have in Christ Jesus, that they might bring us into bondage, to whom we gave place of subjection, no, not for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you. Verse 6, but of these who seemed to be somewhat, whatsoever they were, it maketh no matter to me, God accepteth no man's person. For they were seemed to be somewhat in conference, added nothing to me. But contrariwise, when they saw that the gospel of the uncircumcision was communicated or committed unto me, as the gospel of circumcision was unto Peter, for he that wrought effectually in Peter to the apostleship of the circumcision, the same was mighty in me toward the Gentiles. And when James, when you read it in the King James, it gets kind of flowery, and the New American Standard seemed to be a lot nicer if you read it. You seem to follow it a little bit better.
I can put it in here if you want.
Verse 9 says, and when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be the pillars, perceived the grace that was given unto me, they gave to me and Barnabas the right hands of fellowship, that we should go unto the heathen, and they unto the circumcision. Only they would that we should remember the poor, the same which I also was forward to do. Verse 11 says, but when Peter was come to Antioch, I withstood him to the face, because he was to be blamed. For behold, before that certain came from James, he did eat with the Gentiles.
Would you like to use mine? It's a slightly larger print.
That's all right. But when they were come, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing them which were of the circumcision. And the other Jews dissembled likewise with him, insomuch that Barnabas also was carried away with their dissimulation. But when I saw that they walked not uprightly according to the truth of the gospel, I said unto Peter before them all, if thou being a Jew livest after the manner of Gentiles, and not as do the Jews, why compellest thou the Gentiles to live as do the Jews? We who are Jews by nature, and not sinners of the Gentiles, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by the faith of Jesus Christ, even we have believed in Jesus Christ, that we might be justified by the faith of Christ, and not by the works of the law. For by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified. But if, while we seek to be justified by Christ, we ourselves also are found sinners, is therefore Christ the minister of sin? God forbid. For if I build again the things which I destroyed, I make myself a transgressor. For I, through the law, am dead to the law, that I might live unto God. I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me, gave himself for me. I do not frustrate the grace of God. For if righteousness came by the law, then Christ is dead in vain. And so you can see why some people would come to the conclusion that the law is just unnecessary when you start looking at some of those bad verses, those later verses there. Okay.
But even still, it's not incorrect. It's just incorrect.
So Paul,
it's just it's just people misinterpreting it.
Yeah. Paul knows that he's kind of going into the lion's den here because he's heard a lot of things, and in fact, not only is he going into the lion's den, but it was told to him that he was going to be killed. There was a plot to actually take his life. Why were people out to get rid of him?
Well, the Jews were out to get rid of him because he had defected and was winning people over to Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
Right, but the Jews, the first 250,000 converts, were of course all Jewish. And for the first 10 years or so, I mean, the gospel was being presented to the Jewish communities.
But there was persecution rising up against Christians in general.
Right, why was that?
Because they weren't Jewish, let's say. They weren't strictly Jewish by their faith.
Well, the Romans also feared the Christians because their numbers were increasing, and the Roman leadership was very paranoid. And so here's this group that's growing by leaps and bounds, and they're very suspicious of any group.
And also, the rumors flying around that they have this other king.
Yes.
That they worship another king, another god, or whatever.
It says here,
the Romans considered Caesar to be their god.
Yeah. But the Jews had a special dispensation to not worship Caesar.
right. So
And
Paul
it became an issue later, which is why he says in another one of his writings that talks about people who are not Jews and who are Jews giving up the people,
Well, you can relate to. First of all, anybody that is a preacher of the gospel is going to have the non-believer that's not interested in anything that you have to say because you are a Christian. So you have animosity from that standpoint. And some people can take it or leave it. Some people have an opinion of, if you want to be a Christian, that's fine, but it's not for me. So you have that kind of disinterested kind of perspective. But then you have people that are actually combative against Christians or the conservative view because they're being faced with something that may be correct and they don't want to feel condemned. And so you have that aspect, that element at work as well.
You could also see the Jewish leadership being concerned about loss of control, because control was uppermost in the minds of the Pharisees. They wanted to control Jesus from the time he began preaching.
Right.
And so when this Christian stuff began to rear its head, that had to be very chaotic in a lot of ways, because these were all people still attending the synagogues from week to week, but bringing their message to teach. So that had to be very upsetting to their apple cart, because they were used to this system that they had fine-tuned with all these rules and regulations, and now here's this group of people just infiltrating everything and changing the whole system.
Right. So they were just bringing Jesus, the Messiah, into the system that they had already been very comfortable with.
Well, that and taking out the traditions that a lot of them had.
That's where the rub came in.
That's where the rub came in.
When the Christians began to push against doing the Jewish traditions, then the leaders began to say, wait a minute now.
Yeah, it says here, just a little commentary out of the book of Acts of the Apostles. It says, afterwards, when it became apparent that the converts among the Gentiles were increasing rapidly, there were a few of the leading brethren at Jerusalem who began to cherish anew their former prejudices against the methods of Paul and his associates. So there's this wanting to hang on to traditions and customs and things that they were familiar with. It says, these prejudices strengthened with the passing of the years until some of the leaders determined that the work of preaching the gospel must henceforth be conducted in accordance with their own ideas. So, that's the same thing that people deal with today. You have somebody come along and they may have a little different idea.
They want to take a closer look at the prophecies and the timelines.
Well, it's like you said, it's about control. It's about control. You've heard the term loose cannon. Sometimes the people that are conference officials, if they get wind of somebody doing something a little bit different, they use the term, well, here's a loose cannon. We need to keep a close eye on this person because they might overstep their bounds or whatever. But Paul's
they do this under the guise of trying to keep everything decently and done in order, but the reality is they're worried about losing control of the situation and losing income.
So here was their attitude. If Paul would conform his methods to certain policies which they advocated, they would acknowledge and sustain his work. Otherwise, they could no longer look upon it with favor or grant it their support. So, again, it's all about, hey, if you're gonna do this, as long as you play by our rules, and as long as you advocate certain policies. And Paul, you got to remember, where did he come from? He was on the other side, so to speak, in many regards. In fact, he was a chief Pharisee.
He was the kind of the brightest young star.
I mean, he not only he persecuted and killed Christians. That was his. He was antagonistic to the core against Christianity. So he was one of them that was a hardliner.
Defending the Jewish system.
He was a hardliner, if you will. And then God knocked him off his high horse, as I mentioned last week. But it says here, these men had lost sight of the fact that God is the teacher of his people. Right? That every worker in his cause is to obtain an individual experience in following the divine leader, not looking to man for direct guidance, but looking, of course, for the divine instruction.
Well, that's very much what happened when Jesus was ministering, was that the Pharisees wanted to know, how could Jesus know these things? He hadn't gone to their schools. How could he be teaching with this authority when he wasn't one of their rabbinical students? Well, we see the same thing in many churches today. They want to know what kind of alphabet soup you have after your name, because how dare you speak with any type of authority about Bible topics when you haven't gone to seminary and studied these things out.
Yeah, I don't know who it was. I think it was probably Paul, because one of the things that Paul wanted to do, that he was inspired to do, is he really wanted to bring the Jews and the Gentiles together, right? But he wanted to bring them together under the auspices that it's not the law that saves you. It's not your right doing that saves you, which is where the Jews had gravitated to with all their customs and traditions. But he said he wanted to really bring to the forefront the concept that we are saved by works. You understand that, right? But whose works?
Christ's works.
We are saved by his right doing, which is his righteousness. That's what Christ's righteousness is. It's Christ's right doing.
Yeah.
It's his right doing. It's the covenant that he had with his Father. That all of that. It's faith in that. It's belief in that. It's understanding that and believing it.
And as human beings, we always want to go toward what we can do.
We always want to say, but what do we have to contribute? What do we have to bring to the equation? And that's where the Jews went. And so and then over time, they started formulating all of these stipulations and requirements, and it all became tradition and custom and all this kind of thing. And so then it became all about what they had to do in order to be saved, and not what Christ and the Father was doing.
This is also about Paul talking about Peter, how Peter was separating himself from the Gentiles too because of circumcision.
Well, you know,
and Paul was just like, why does that even matter?
And that's what's interesting, is because Paul, having been a Pharisee, would have been understanding that the circumcision was the sign of true conversion to Judaism.
To the Abrahamic covenant.
Right.
Yeah.
And but it was interesting. I heard the background on Gary Simon's message last night. He said that if you wanted to convert to Judaism as a man, you went through all the teaching, and you had to not only learn the Torah, but you had to accept and embrace the oral traditions.
Right.
All of the traditions passed down by the rabbis, the ways they did things. Like he gave the example that some people feel compelled to light candles to welcome the Sabbath. Mm-hmm. He said there's nothing scriptural about lighting candles. There's nothing unscriptural about it, but it is not a mandate. But in these oral traditions, a lot of these things were passed down as mandates. And he said if you became a convert to Judaism, the last thing you would do after learning these two things with the oral traditions and the Torah was you would go through the circumcision. But even then, they had built a wall that you had to stay behind a certain area. You couldn't even offer sacrifices in the temple. Even if you were a convert to Judaism and were welcomed as one of the brethren, the Jews put up what they call the wall of separation. Now, I don't know if that's what's called the court of the Gentiles.
Right.
That the converted Jews from the Gentiles could be out here. They couldn't go into the court.
Right.
Yeah.
They had to be out here.
There was still segregation.
Yeah, there was that segregation and that prejudice against them. And so Peter was actually concerned about that. He knew that Jesus had called him to go feed my sheep. So he was calling him to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. He was working among those. And then when Paul came along and Paul's ministering to the Gentiles, Peter could see the merit of it, but as soon as he got around the conservative Jews, he went back to being prejudiced and separating himself from the Gentiles, as though somehow he was going with them, and it began to influence the church.
Like, you hypocrite.
And of course, one of the things that's happening here, of course, Paul is going up with a whole entourage of people, like you mentioned last week, and he's taking a big offering. There was this big offering that Paul, I think, initiated, connected from his missionary trips, from Gentile churches, and this money was all going up to Judea to help the poor in Judea, right? And so, I mean, this was a very heartfelt expression from the Christian Gentiles to want to really help their Jewish brethren that were in need, okay, because of famine and other things. They were really in need. But that was looked upon as, some type of...
second class.
Some type of leverage that Paul was trying to... Paul's whole motive was to try to bring together, try to help the Jews understand the Gentiles, they love you. They want to help you, and that's the Christian thing to do.
And to get them to understand that God loves the Gentiles, and He wanted us to reach them as well.
Yeah,
that's why He put Israel where He did, right there at the crossroads of all the trading, so that they could spread the message, and instead they hid it.
It says that He went up by revelation. What does that mean?
God impressed him to do something?
Yeah, this wasn't just his own idea, his own thinking, what can I do to bring these people together? This was something that was God-inspired. And yet, Paul also, by revelation, realized that this is going to turn out bad for him, personally. Right? And there were people that came and warned him, even. There's a plot to kill you, you can't go this way. You can't take this boat. You can't do this because they're plotting. And they were plotting to kill him primarily, as we mentioned, because not only was he wanting to bring the Gentiles into the equation and give them equal status under the gospel, but he was also trying to tell them, you've been deceived into thinking that you can save yourself by the things that you're doing.
I'd say perhaps in our generation, the most thing we could relate this to is the issue of the civil rights and segregation that we had in this country. and how when they began to be a lot of agitation about them not being treated as second-class citizens, how some people wanted to kill the ones that had that message.
As you read through the commentary on Galatians here, and God was also giving the leadership in Jerusalem an opportunity to really kind of come clean. And it says here that they were given like a golden opportunity for all the leading brethren to confess frankly that God had wrought through Paul. They could see the success that he was having, but then they didn't want that success. They only wanted that success to go so far. They didn't want it to reach the place where they were considered equal, etc.
Second-class saints, that's what they wanted.
Yeah. It says, and that at times they had erred in permitting the reports of his enemies to arouse their jealousy and prejudice. In other words, they really couldn't even get behind him, even though they knew it in their hearts he was doing a very positive, very productive thing. The hardliners would come and fuss about it, and they couldn't even stand up for him. And they had an opportunity to do that. And
well, some of it too was this fear, because the hardliners could make it very difficult with the Roman government and accuse these Christians of sedition.
Yeah.
Of working against the government, which they weren't doing, but they were working against the government within the church system.
Right. So I'm just trying to point out, that Paul has, he has the outsiders, the Romans and whatnot, that could potentially give him problems, even though he is a Jew or a Roman citizen. And then you have the church, which you would think would really be behind him and support him. They've got big question marks about the way he's been working and who he's been working with and what he's been doing about his ministry.
It's that not invented here thing. We did tell you to do this. Yeah. We aren't controlling it. Therefore, how can we endorse it?
And yet, so anyway, he gets up there. Things seem like they're kind of going okay, right? He finally gets up to Jerusalem, and things seem to be going pretty well. But you know that the enemy of souls is not going to sit by and just let all of this blessing unfold in this city and on these people. And the devil's going to always try to step in there and distort so that things really can't happen.
We also have to keep in mind that this is a letter that Paul is writing to the Galatians back in Turkey,
right,
telling them about his experiences going to Jerusalem. And it was kind of interesting where he said, I took with me Titus and Barnabas.
Right.
And they didn't compel Titus to be circumcised, even though he was a Gentile convert.
Right.
So if the leading brethren in Jerusalem, which was the center of their Christian
he was a
hub,
Greek.
And I'm saying if they didn't compel him to be circumcised, then who are you back there in Turkey? Who are these people back in Turkey trying to tell you that you need to have the circumcision?
Right.
So he was saying, headquarters isn't even doing this. Right. The main movers and shakers, the people who actually saw Jesus face to face, are not compelling new converts to be circumcised.
Right, but of course, as you're saying here, they had people that were basically spying on his trip. They're trying to keep an eye on him, and basically trying to see where if he stepped over the line, they would be able to accuse him of different things. There were people that had big question marks about Paul.
Oh, I think too. Every church we've ever been in, you have the people who are middle of the road, but you always have this ultra-conservative element of people who are so gung-ho about wanting to do all the right things and cross all the T's and dot all the I's, that they become very legalistic and they want everything done their way. And we've seen, the inroads with like the lunar Sabbath people that are promoting that, and a lot of other little things that are out there that are peripheral, aren't even necessarily scriptural, aren't even accurate, but some of these people are so bent in this legalistic direction. They are very much like the Pharisees were. They want to make sure everything is done. They got this checklist. They've got to check everything off. And they can't allow anybody else to deviate from this checklist they've created in their heads. Not necessarily that they're spying like they were a bunch of Pharisees trying to take information back, but they were so zealous for getting everything right that they would destroy the church in their efforts to make things according to their pattern.
And of course, Paul may have been right or wrong in his thinking in regards to how he could influence the leadership in Jerusalem. It says here, many of the Jews who had accepted the gospel still cherished a regard for the ceremonial law and were only too willing to make unwise concessions, hoping thus to gain the confidence of their countrymen, to remove their prejudice and to win them to faith in Christ as the world's Redeemer. Paul realized that so long as many of the leading members of the church of Jerusalem should continue to cherish prejudice against him, they would work constantly to counteract his influence.
Right.
So he realizes all this. He felt that if, by any reasonable concession, he could win them to the truth, he would remove a great obstacle to the success of the gospel in other places. But he was not authorized by God to concede as much as they asked. So they kept pushing him, to try to make concessions in regards to his methods and who he was trying to win. And of course, he would keep telling them, you don't get it, I'm doing what God has asked me to do. That's all I can do. And
the organized church has always been afraid of people
that
who
were
listened
thinking outside the box.
who were different and were
Thinking
just
outside the
letting the
box.
Lord lead them and do something a little differently. They've always felt very threatened by that.
It says, when we think of Paul's great desire to be in harmony with his brethren, his tenderness toward the weak in the faith, his reverence for the apostles who had been with Christ and for James, the brother of the Lord, and his purpose to become all things to all men so far as he could without sacrificing principle, when we think of all of this, it is less surprising that he was constrained to deviate from the firm, decided course that he had hitherto followed. It was confirmed to him through the Spirit that he was going to become a prisoner in Rome and that he eventually would be killed. And even though people were warning him, he still said, I've got to do this. I'm constrained to do this. It was the Spirit of God that was pushing him in that direction.
He knew this was his mission because
Right.
he, with his education and his background, could speak to leaders in high political offices and have them actually listen more than they would have to somebody who was common or uneducated or from the poorer strata of life. He was like a PhD, and so he knew that the political leadership, the emperors and everything, would listen to him.
Yeah, you got to wonder, because Paul could have backed off a bit, and probably his life would have been preserved. And you would think, well, then he would have been able to fight another day or influence for a lot longer. It says, but instead of accomplishing the desired object, his efforts for conciliation only precipitated the crisis, hastened his predicted sufferings, and resulted in separating him from his brethren, depriving the church of one of its strongest pillars. So you got to wonder, why was it that God impressed him to kind of push harder at that moment, when if he had backed off a bit, his life probably would have been spared.
But this is saying that he made some efforts to concede to what they wanted, and that made them more determined to get rid of him.
Right.
That was what made it. Had he not backed off there, and had he stood more firmly against them, he may not have had the same outcome.
Yeah.
It was because they perceived his backing off as a sign of weakness, and that's what made them go
Stronger.
harder after him.
Yeah.
I get my words tangled up today. It's terrible.
Paul goes to the temple, and really this is, I don't know if you remember the story where in Scripture where he is, this is also Acts and also Galatians here, where he's at the temple, and all of a sudden, a big commotion breaks out at the temple. He had been going there. He'd been up there for a while, and he'd been going back and forth kind of unnoticed. He'd been talking to people, as you would expect. But all of a sudden, it says here that a commotion erupted, and of course the Roman guard stepped in, and they actually took him captive, and that preserved his life, or the Jews there would have actually just torn him apart. It says here, on the following day, Paul began to carry out the counsel of the elders, the 4 men who were under the Nazirite vow, the term of which had nearly expired, were taken by Paul into the temple to signify the accomplishment of the days of purification. And see, that's for the Jews. That's what it was all about. It was all about, this is a pure place, and we don't want to contaminate. That's why they had the wall, for separating the Gentiles, etc. And of course, they had different offerings that Paul's up here talking to them about the offerings.
The sad thing is in their efforts to protect against what they perceive as corruption,
right,
they failed to realize that external stuff does not change corruption.
And they
corruption is internal.
At the core, were very corrupt.
Yeah. Right. But corruption, even within the church, has to do with the mind. It doesn't have to do with doorways and fences and walls. You're not going to stop that any more than you can legislate morality and legislate against something and have people not do it. They could legislate gun control tomorrow and demand that nobody own firearms.
Right.
And this country would rise up and
Civil War.
Do it anyway.
Yeah.
Because you're not going to tell people how to live their lives.
Yeah, you've heard the term the holier-than-thou attitude that they developed. It says, those who advised Paul to take this step had not fully considered the great peril to which he would thus be exposed. So it says, at this season, Jerusalem was filled with worshippers from many lands, and as in fulfillment of the commission given him by God, Paul had borne the gospel to the Gentiles. He had visited many of the world's largest cities, and he as well had been known to thousands who from foreign parts had come to Jerusalem to attend the feast. Among these were men whose hearts were filled with bitter hatred for Paul, and for him to enter the temple on a public occasion was to risk his life. For several days he passed in and out among the worshippers, apparently unnoticed, but before the close of the specified period, as he was talking with the priest concerning the sacrifices to be offered, he was recognized by some of the Jews from Asia. So with the fury of demons, they rushed upon him, crying, "Men of Israel, help! This is the man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people, and the law, and this place." So all of a sudden, this riot breaks out, and as the people responded to the call for help, another accusation was added, and further brought Greeks also into the temple, and had polluted this holy place. So all of a sudden, one thing builds on another. They start accusing him of things that didn't actually happen. Right? It says, but the Jewish law, by Jewish law, it was a crime punishable with death for the uncircumcised person to enter the inner courts of the sacred edifice. So not only if you were circumcised, you could go so far, if you were a Gentile, but if you were uncircumcised, you were allowed in the door. It was a death penalty, right? So all this riot breaks out. Eventually the Romans had to come and get a hold of him. And this is the story in Acts there where he's standing on the steps and he waves his hand, right? And he commands silence. And this is the first place where this word is used, where silence is commanded, right? That's the same word that's used in the book of Revelation, where Christ, when he opens the seventh seal, demands silence. There's a great silence, it says, right? That's the same word that's used. The only two places in the Bible that word is used. Here is the other place where silence is commanded, right? And Paul then has an opportunity. He asks the Roman centurion if he can speak to the people. And the Romans think he's an Egyptian. Initially, they think he's an Egyptian hardliner who's causing trouble. That's why they go down and arrest him. But then they find out he's a Roman citizen. And so he asked them to speak. It says, Paul stood on the stairs and beckoned with the hand unto the people. The gesture attracted their attention, while his bearing commanded respect. And this is where this great silence is commanded, if you will. It says, the gesture attracted their attention, while the bearing commanded respect. And when there was a great silence, he spake unto the people in the Hebrew tongue. So that really got everybody's attention. He's not this Egyptian, troublemaker. He's actually a Hebrew. And then once they heard him speaking in Hebrew, it says they kept the more silence. And in the universal hush, he continued. So he goes on to tell them all about who he is, and basically he says, "Hey, I was the most severe persecutor of God's people, but I grew up at the feet of Gamaliel, and taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers, and was zealous toward God, etc." So he goes through and he starts telling them the whole experience. It says, "Hitherto the people had listened with close attention, but when Paul reached the point in his history where he was appointed Christ's ambassador to the Gentiles, their fury broke forth anew." So he was kind of winning them until he got to the place where he told them, "God told me to go to the Gentiles, take the gospel to the Gentiles."
And they simply could not have
They
that.
couldn't handle that. Accustomed to look upon themselves as the only people favored by God, they were unwilling to permit the despised Gentiles to share the privileges which had hitherto been regarded as exclusively their own. This is our club. We don't want no heathen outsiders, being a part of it. And here you are telling us
Bring
that
in all this
God,
riffraff.
that God, told you to go to them specifically. No way. No way. Lifting their voices above the voice of the speaker, they cried, "Away with such a fellow from the earth, for it is not fit that he should live." And
Can you imagine being to the point where you could, okay, it's one thing if you disagree with somebody's viewpoint, if you disagree with a preacher that's preaching a message that you don't agree with, why would you demand their death? These people have got to be demonically
because you have a different
possessed.
opinion. Well, you can see how this kind of thing is going to carry out at the end. How if you have a different opinion about something, and all of a sudden people are going to start accusing you. Like they were accusing him of stuff that didn't actually happen.
Except now it's the opposite end of the issue. God calls us to obedience.
Right.
Away with him.
Yeah.
We don't have to obey anything.
Yeah.
Well, but I'm saying when things start happening and plagues start falling and people start pointing the finger, it's those folks over there because they're different. It's those folks over there that are the gods that they come and make the accusations. God's displeased with them, and we're not going to be able to have peace and harmony until we get rid of them or until they change. God's people aren't going to change at the end. So, they get all, the Romans actually have to protect him from being killed. But they say, this is kind of interesting, well, let's see if we can gain the sympathy of the people. We'll scourge him. We'll scourge him, and maybe the people will have some sympathy.
They didn't have any sympathy on Jesus when they scourged him.
Well, it was all the same thing. The same thing is happening here. So.
Imagine having to go through that kind of an ordeal.
Yeah, and he's not a young man, so the Romans actually scourge him. With 39 lashes.
Was that before they knew he was a Roman?
It says
Because I think
they knew he was a Roman at that point.
I didn't think they were allowed to
They
scourge
asked him. Well, it says here, it says, as they bound him with thongs. Thongs. Yeah, Paul said unto them, unto the centurion that
is
stood
it
by,
lawful to?
is it lawful for you to scourge a man that's a Roman and uncondemned? When the centurion heard this, they went and told the chief captain, saying, take heed what thou doest, for this man is a Roman, etc. So, yeah. But anyway, they've got to protect him. But of course now all the Jews are in an uproar against him, etc.
And so the Romans are scared to death. They're going to have a huge uprising.
Right.
So is that to say that Paul would have probably prolonged his life if he wasn't so direct all the time?
Yeah, I mean, he could have, he didn't have to be necessarily in the temple talking to the priests and so forth. He knew he was running the risk because of his other journeys all over the place. He knew he was running the, and of course they were there at a festival.
But had
so
he stood for the principle that these things are not necessary, and if you want someone to do this, find someone else.
In other words, he could have played, he could have been there and just stayed a little more obscure and not been exposed. And of course, by being exposed there in the temple, somebody recognized him, and this all broke out, and then they arrested him and whatnot. But see,
I think Paul knew that the temple services and everything were no longer binding. I think he understood that Christ had come to put an end to those things, to fulfill them. And of course, it was only a matter of 20 more years, and the temple would be destroyed and would never be. The Jewish system would come tumbling down because they couldn't have priests and
right.
temple sacrifices and everything.
Right.
So what if he had not wanted to be conciliatory toward the legalists?
Well, see, that's the thing. I think that's the reason why it went the way it did, because Paul was there trying to really get a message across to them that this whole temple service that you've distorted, it was all about pointing to Messiah anyway. That's the key. It was to point to him, right? In fact, he's the reality of the whole thing, right? And they couldn't get past all their ritual and ceremony to even see that. They couldn't see him because of that. So eventually God took it away.
What if instead of Paul giving in and going to do this ritual thing with the Nazirite vow, if he'd said, sorry, you guys are on your own. This is not scriptural, this is not mandated.
Right.
He might have had a totally different outcome, because the riot wouldn't have broken out there.
Right. Well, I'm saying if he had played a lower, kept more low key.
It wasn't low key. It was that what she says there is that he was trying to be all things to all people.
Right.
And so he was trying to give an inch to these people, not realizing that the people in that mindset, you can't give in to that. They are bullying, they are urging their viewpoint, and they're pushing down on that. And if he would have just said, no way, I'm out of here, not going to do it.
And what about when he confronted Peter? I mean, he got right in his face. And
I think it says a lot about his very bold personality.
yeah. But I mean, here are two Hebrews, right?
He could have rebuked him privately, but because Peter's action was a public action, he had to say something publicly to put a stop to it. See, Peter had been living like the Gentiles, working with the Gentiles and doing just fine, but suddenly he gets around these conservative Jews and he decides he better lay low.
Right.
And
So
I think Paul already had the experience of saying, it doesn't work. You can't give in to these people.
Yeah.
You have to stand for
Seems
truth.
like it.
I mean, I don't think Paul was not standing for truth and giving in to these people that were urging him to go for the Nazirite thing. But I think he didn't realize the magnitude, and I think by the time he confronted Peter, he saw where that had led. You can't back down. When these people are urging you to do something that you know is not scriptural, you need to stand up and say, no, I'm not doing it. And I'm sure Peter, had to have been a bit embarrassed that Paul would call him out publicly.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think that also we don't understand the Jewish culture, and that those kind of things really weren't uncommon.
And of course, Peter seemed to be somewhat conciliatory with the concept that the Gentiles were lower class Christians.
Right.
If thou being a Jew livest after the manner of Gentiles, and not as do the Jews, why compellest thou the Gentiles to live as do the Jews? We who are Jews by nature and not sinners of the Gentiles, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law. So he's just reminding something that Peter, I think, knew and understood, but when he got around all of these other influences, he seemed to not be able to take a mighty stand.
Susan says, death cannot silence that voice, though. It emboldens it.
Yeah.
But he went up by revelation. God was calling him to do this.
Yeah.
Well, I agree that God called him to go back to Jerusalem and meet with the apostles. I just question the idea that God was calling him to go do the Nazirite vow thing. I think that in giving into that, when he knew it wasn't necessary, that he caused more problems for himself and for the work in general than he would have if he'd just said, no, I'm not doing that.
Right, but I think that God was giving the Jews an opportunity to see the reality of the gospel message, knowing that in 20 years down the road that the whole temple system was going to be taken away anyway.
Right. It had to be already compromised to some extent because they knew at the crucifixion that the veil had been torn in half.
Right.
So if the veil was already gone and they knew the Ark of the Covenant was gone, the most central part of the tabernacle service was gone.
Yeah, God's presence and everything.
Right.
Yeah.
His presence was gone, and then at the crucifixion of his son, then that veil that separated the most holy from the holy place was torn in half. Therefore, it was a sign that this whole thing is done. This particular element is done. Here's the real thing.
Yeah, the reality had already come.
And all these people that are waiting for a third temple to be built because they think that somehow that will
bring about the actual millennial reign of Christ on the planet.
They just fail to understand what Paul was saying right back there. This is done. This is over.
They just come right back to where we were.
Yep.
They went right back to that original thing. Okay, well now he's going to go set up his millennial kingdom.
Yeah, exactly. So Paul says, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, he knows that Peter knows and understands that. But by the faith of Jesus Christ, even we have believed in Jesus Christ that we might be justified by the faith of Christ. See, by the faith of Christ and not by the works of the law. So it's because, just like his faithfulness keeps us alive day by day, his faithfulness also is what will save us eternally. His faithfulness to the covenant with his Father. Because of that faithfulness, because of his works. It's trusting in that. It's having faith in his works, that not the stipulations of the law that you follow. So, for by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified. So, that doesn't say anything about the permanence or the temporariness of the law. It's talking about the works of the law. Doesn't justify. Basically, just saying that you cannot. No matter, there's no
merit.
Can't
be saved or get any brownie points.
There's no merit in anything that you do. That's all it's really saying. There's no merit in anything you do that would afford salvation for you.
Susan said they needed the eyes of their understanding to be open. Everything they had learned was going to crumble around them. That was too great of a change or storm for them to weather.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is, Christianity's in its infancy here. It's the Jews, many of them are starting to get a glimpse of what it really means. The Gentiles who weren't prejudiced with ceremony and tradition and circumstance, they didn't have to unlearn any of that. You know, of course, they probably their own heathen practices and ideas and things of that nature. But here's this new thing that involves the God and the Messiah, and it makes sense to them. To the Jews, it probably didn't make much sense at first.
And I expect a lot of the Judaizers in Galatia were Jewish people who had been in Jerusalem and probably talked to some of these legalistic leaders who were saying, you know, we've got to protect our system, God gave us this, you know, we've got to hold the old landmarks, they might say, you know. So they thought they were doing what God wanted in trying to urge everybody to hold on to the Jewish traditions. They didn't yet understand that those traditions were just man-made junk.
Paul says here, he says, for if I build again the things which I destroyed, I make myself a transgressor. For I through the law am dead to the law, that I might live unto God. And see, when people see language like that, they think that being dead to the law means that the law
is dead.
But what does it mean for you to be dead to the law?
I zoned out on what I was thinking.
Oh.
I'm not sure
I
what
can
you're
ask the question again. What does it mean to be
Dead to the law.
dead to the law? See, it actually, the way Paul comes across here, it almost sounds like he's giving you a choice.
What does it mean to be dead by the
Right.
dead by the law?
Dead to the law.
Well, look at the it says,
Be a transgressor?
for I through the law am dead to the law, that I might live unto God. It seems like he's giving you this choice. Either you can follow the law or you can follow God. It seems like he's giving people this choice. And any Christian is going to say, well, I want to just follow God. You know, I want to have faith in God and follow God. I don't want to follow the law. I mean, isn't that the way you could read that? I mean, isn't that the way some people read that?
Well, I think beginning in verse 16 where he said the man is not justified by the works of the law. When he says he is dead to the law, he's not saying the law is dead. He's saying the penalty of the law no longer affects him because he's accepted what Christ did as the law.
So the law condemns, and because of Christ playing his substitutionary role,
The law no longer condemns us.
He became our condemnation. He took our condemnation. In other words, he, as an innocent person, died. He took our place. You know, because every person is condemned by the law, because we're all sinners.
Scott says the works implies action as in the sacrifices and ordinances of the Mosaic law, not the moral law or 10 Commandments.
So you think Paul is talking about, I think he's talking about both here. Because even the keeping of the 10 Commandments doesn't merit us entrance to heaven, right?
Well, not in terms of that being the sole component, but ignoring them.
That's a sign of you being on the right path, at least. Keeping the 10 Commandments.
Because I mean, like, while I would say that it doesn't, there's no way obedience to the 10 Commandments, other than if you actually did keep them perfectly, could merit salvation. You know, like Jesus did. You know, from the beginning of your birth.
Right,
right.
And there's no way, because Christ came in a justified state, and you lived a sanctified life. We don't even have that. When we're born into the world, we're not justified. We have to make a choice. We have to recognize who we are as a sinner in need of a Savior. So we have to make the choice to be justified. And if once we make that choice to repent and accept Him, He freely justifies us, yes. See?
Sounds like this is a topic we need to dig into a little bit deeper.
Well, I'm just saying.
I'm saying to exhaust it and to really be able to get a deeper understanding of it. I don't want to skim over something that we need to talk about more fully. Scott says, dead to the law is being decoupled from the law and the requirements thereof.
Well, see, I don't know if I would say, I mean, because like Elijah's saying here, I mean, the law is like, he says in another place, the law is like a mirror. It points out, right? It's like a school teacher. It's like an instructor. It's like a mirror. It points out
It helps you
when,
learn.
a mirror points out when your face is dirty, right? So you don't pick up a brick and break the mirror to clean your face, right? So the law has a benefit. When Jesus was here, He kept the law perfectly, right? And that aspect benefited all of us, because by having faith in what He did, that is what merits salvation for us.
What if what he's really talking about is not the Mosaic law or the Torah, but he's talking about the oral traditions? Because that's what all of this was about, was these oral traditions that the Jews wanted the Christians to observe.
Right.
I mean, the circumcision was not part of the Ten Commandments.
Right.
And so what he's talking about, I get the feeling, looking at this, that he's going after Peter because he's, pretending to make the Gentiles second-class citizens, even though he didn't do that in his everyday life. He's basically saying that these other things that we've added to this are not essential.
Right, but really it applies to all of it, I think, because I think the word that's used here is nones, or whatnot, for law. But
did they use that term? I mean, just like we talked about the term wine, that can refer to fermented wine or grape juice.
Right.
Could this law term be used to refer to the Mosaic law and the oral traditions?
Well, I think the word indicates a broad stroke, that it really applies to all of it. Mm-hmm. Right? You see, there is nothing that we as human beings, there's nothing that we can add to, there's nothing we can do, there's no payment we can make, there's nothing we can contribute, whether it's a work, whether it's a gesture, whether it's whatever. There's nothing that we can do to merit, to make salvation available to ourselves. The only thing we can do is by faith accept what the Savior has done, His right doing.
But I could also see the application to it.
And faith in that, then His right doing is merited to us.
Well, this says that word law can be used as anything established,
Right.
anything received by
Anything
usage, a
established.
custom, a law, or a command of any law whatsoever.
It's a broad stroke.
A law or rule producing a state approved by God, by the observance of what was approved by God. Can also apply to the Mosaic law, referring actually to the context, either to the volume of the law or its contents, to the Christian religion, or the name of the more important part, the Pentateuch, is put for the entire collection of the sacred books. So those first 5 books refer to the law and the prophets.
Yeah.
So I think he's covering the whole gamut here, because, like you said, Peter is bringing in ceremonial stuff, traditional stuff, oral stuff, but even the Ten Commandment moral law. There's nothing we can do. We can keep that. That's what the Jews were trying to do. They were trying to keep that perfectly as well. That's what people call legalism today.
Scott says work implies doing something, but the Decalogue is a list of 10 things not to do.
Right.
That's a good distinction.
It is. It is. That's a good point.
That's an interesting thought.
Yeah. But in not doing, if you don't kill somebody, then you're preserving their life. So you are doing something in that regard.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I do think it's interesting too, though, to note that, I mean, the context of the conversation does seem to center less around the Ten Commandments and more around this conversation of like circumcision and Peter segregating himself.
All of these oral traditions.
And I mean, not to say that that's wrong at all either. Like, I completely agree with that point theologically.
But I get the feeling that in context, when you look at this whole storyline, he's referring to the circumcision and the Gentiles and whether they get treated well.
Well, the fact that verse 15 brings in lineage is he was like, we who are Jews by nature, and then goes on to explain how we're not justified by works. You know, which I mean, I would agree with from both law standpoints as well.
Right. And if we're not justified by works, then the works of the Ten Commandments don't save us, and the works of the ceremonial stuff don't save us.
Right, does.
But faith is not works, is it?
I mean, when Jesus was here, he followed a lot of the tradition and a lot of the custom.
And he didn't.
I mean, yeah, he didn't just chuck the whole thing. I mean, he was sympathetic with a lot of where they had gone.
Yeah.
But
what's the thing though? Like, even that whole discussion only surrounds the Sabbath. That's the only thing people have an issue with, really.
Right.
That's true.
Because no one thinks it's right to kill anybody. Because if so, then what Paul is saying is murder, kill, do whatever you want.
Right.
Which no one would agree that Paul is saying. Everyone would say, well, no, we still keep the Ten Commandments for.
That's always the funny part. I get people on after we have this discussion.
Only have an issue with the Sabbath.
And that's really what it boils down to. Nobody in the Christian community would say it was okay to lie, steal, commit adultery, murder.
Well,
The only thing that Christians don't want to do is keep the Sabbath.
Even though all you have to do is believe in God, and no matter what, you're saved if you believe in God.
Well, I was telling you some time ago about that lady I used to talk with all the time, where we were just having this back and forth conversation of like, you know, she was like, you don't have to keep the law. So I was like, you're telling me I can kill then? She's like, yeah, but if you're a real Christian, you won't. And I was like, but you're telling me I can kill. And I just kept re-emphasizing that point, like, you're telling me I can, that it's okay.
But then I would say if you're a real Christian, you would also keep the Sabbath. Right?
So you're telling me that if you're a real Christian, you'll obey the law, and that's the evidence that you do, but you don't have to, so I can. And it kept coming back to that. It was like, you keep telling me I can, I don't have to obey the law. Like, you know, like either I can or I can't, like, you know, just such a funny back and forth.
In essence, laws are all about what you can't do. The only reason for a law is to restrict you in some respect. There's not a law saying that you have to do a certain thing. But these oral traditions became things that you had to do.
Right.
Well, yeah, I mean, to restrict you, but also to protect you. You know, the idea of not killing somebody is protection for both of you.
Yep, supposedly.
On a spiritual and physical level.
Here's 122.
Yeah, but I think that's a different topic than what they're talking about. He's talking about like nitpicking over things like segregation and how Peter was being hypocritical when he would separate himself from uncircumcised people and.
Right, he's basically confronting Peter and saying you got to stand up for what you know is the truth.
Yeah, basically he just called Peter a hypocrite and was like, you need to.
Yeah, right. So.
See if there's any other comments here from Scott or Susan. I don't see any.
Yeah.
Dan and Susan say, if you love him, you will keep his commandments.
That's it.
Mm-hmm.
And if you keep them in your heart, you don't have to think about obeying them. I mean, I by virtue of my connection with Christ, I don't have the slightest desire to kill, to cheat, to lie. I don't have a desire to.
Right.
You know, it doesn't.
It's just like you don't have a desire to smoke.
Yeah, it doesn't even enter into the equation. I don't have to consciously say,
I'm not going to do this today.
I'm not going to lie about this.
Yeah,
Now, there may be a situation where I might feel pressured and be tempted to lie, but just in general, I don't even think about wanting to do those things. You know, it's not even a desire.
And that's the difference, the expression getting the cart before the horse. A lot of people, the Jews were at the place where they believed that all the little things that they were doing merited them salvation. I'm as long as I can do all these things, I'm in the club, I'm good. Paul's coming along saying, no, you're not good, because all those things don't mean anything.
You're actually blind, naked.
Yeah, right, exactly. They don't mean anything to God. It's what the Messiah has done. It's the covenant between the Father and the Son. It's what they've done that enables them to justify you. You believe that by faith. Now that doesn't leave out the instruction. The instruction is beneficial, right? Because it guides you through life in a positive direction, in a direction of right doing. But it's not your right doing that is, not your right doing. Just like with Noah, we talked about that before. Noah did all this stuff for 120 years, right?
He did everything the Lord asked him to do.
Peter says, what's been provided for you is an entrance. Well, you have to walk through the entrance, right? And of course, once Noah walked through the door and he was on the boat, he could not close the door. He could not save himself, even though he had done.
not closed the door, he would have been just as dead as everybody else.
Right. So all of his labor, all of his work, all of his effort would have meant nothing, right? But it gave God the opportunity to seal him.
Which probably seemed all the more crazy to people watching him build it. Anybody with any sense about it would look at the door and go,
say,
how are you supposed to shut that thing?
Yeah, right, yeah.
Oh, we're not. God's going to. All right.
God didn't give me that part of the diagram.
Well, the thing of it is, what if he only gave that information to Noah? What if the kids, the people actually building the boat, said, Dad, what's up with this? What have you designed? What are we going to design so we can get the door closed? I mean, if it really is going to rain, right, like you say, so I can.
God didn't tell me to put a hinge on the door, so.
Yeah.
Or a handle on our side, or whatever.
And to me, that had to be just an immense door, because those people were very powerful, and they were very clever and smart. I can't imagine they wouldn't have been able to think of something to,
Or even just have a ladder to get on the ship instead, instead of a hole in the side.
Right. Yeah, but you got this big hole in the side of the boat.
Had to have room for the animals.
That thing is not going to get sealed.
Oh, that's true.
Wow. If that's not going to get sealed up, then we're wasting our time. We wasted all our time.
How it must have been constructed to properly seal so that way water didn't just come pouring in anyways.
Yeah.
Because I doubt. I guess they were in there for a week, so I guess the door could have been closed and then they could have started pitching it.
Yeah, I got some ideas how it could have been done, but.
Dan and Susan said, one more point, love compelled Paul to go by revelation, to heed the voice of God instead of doing what he thought might be acceptable.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The only thing I think of is one of Sister White's comments about her husband working so hard to share the message that he prematurely died.
Right.
She was like, if he had just been more
paced
himself, then he could have been more useful in the long run.
Right.
And that's kind of how I view situations like Paul, is he was almost just so gung-ho about the message that it cost him his life when he could have maybe been around for a much longer time to make a much better difference.
But I think it was beneficial, actually beneficial. I mean, it was, I think, part of God's plan that he agitate things to the place that he did.
Well, it also shows the state at which they were in their thinking and stuff, and it also is an example of what they're going to be like in the end as well, for him pushing it so much too.
Oh, there'll be, logic and common sense and decency and all that, go totally out the window.
One of the reasons he probably was so urgent is because he was sure the Lord was coming again very soon.
Yeah, I think so.
He probably didn't care if he got killed, because.
It'll be 3 minutes.
Yeah.
Instead, it was 20,000 years. 2,000? From Paul's time? Thought we were farther.
Well, we'll continue chapter 3.
Always after Jesus.
Next week.
Oh, yeah.
Like you said, the language becomes so convoluted, it's often hard to figure out what is really being said.
It's just different.
Well, if you were there and spoke Hebrew, it probably would have made more sense.
I've wondered about that, if getting one of the Hebrew Bibles might make a little more sense, or some of these. Of course, in his day it would have been Aramaic or Greek.
Yeah. I just mean if you were there to hear the direct words he was using when he was talking to somebody or when they
Oh,
were
yeah.
reading the letter.
I'm
And
sure
if
it
he
wouldn't be
spoke that
confusing.
language, you know, it's just because we don't have necessarily direct translations for certain words, and so we just have to find the sentence that makes the most sense for whatever expression or, you know.
And even still, in the King James, it almost sounds like broken, weird English.
I think too, it's also Jewish culturally tend not to make statements as much as they do continually asking questions, and I think a lot of his material is actually questions. You know, if I being this, you know, should I do this?
Yeah, well,
It's
he was saying like
questions,
this. He was saying
whereas we
like,
would do statements in our culture, but
I
they
do
do
this, so I
questions.
shouldn't do that.
well, yeah, he was talking also about like how should we do away with the law and stuff, and then he was like, God forbid, because he didn't say like, you know, we should do away with the law. He was like, should we do away with the law?
Right.
Or does the grace of God make the law of God of no effect?
Yeah. You'll see over and over in Scripture, it's questions, because
Right,
questions make you think.
It shows you the benefit. It's never been about the law going away or being abrogated.
Scott says Noah had to have faith, the door would be closed, just as Abraham was justified by his faith, and we are all justified by our faith.
That's right.
Faith is the key.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
true.
You're justified by faith.
Yeah. It's belief in his right doing, his righteousness. So,
But the law is still a necessary part of that too, though.
yeah, that can never go away. I mean,
Well, because sanctification is part of that
It's a
salvation
standard.
process.
Yeah, well, I mean, faith without works is dead. So
I mean,
you're just
for a
like,
Christian, for a true Christian, to
Faith without works is
think
flooded.
that somehow the law is something that God made, it's something that's
It's an
the
expression of
foundation
his
of his
character.
throne
Yeah, I mean,
could just go away. The greatest evidence that the law couldn't go away was that he came and died.
yeah, Noah. I mean, imagine if Noah was just like, oh, God will build a boat, and just sat there like,
God, you have told me of this boat. I will just wait
I
patiently.
will just pray for it.
Yeah.
I will pray that you
Send the boat,
send a
Lord.
boat.
Send
Lord.
the
Noah would have died, and his family and humanity would
I
have
mean,
been
it's
extinct.
possible too that God may have spoken to other people with a similar message.
And they just ignored it, or they just.
I mean, that's speculative, but it's still fun to think
Well,
about.
Scripture says that Noah was the only righteous one left, pretty much.
But it
Yeah.
doesn't
No, he
mean-
wasn't the only one righteous. There were other relatives of his who died before the flood that were
before, yeah.
righteous. You know,
Before.
Methuselah, for example.
Yeah, well, there were a whole line of them.
So there were a whole line of them, but he had to find somebody who,
The
first off, was
have I
young
found
enough
righteous before
and had enough faith to tackle this kind of a building
Maybe even
project
enough
for 120
resources.
years.
Yeah, enough information, enough whatever. Of course, 100 years is plenty of time to figure out how to build a ship.
Sure.
You know.
He could have been a shipbuilder from a boat builder anyway. Just
Yeah.
to make it bigger. God just came to him and said,
Just-
you need to
yeah.
make it bigger. No, I mean bigger, really bigger. Bigger yet.
No sails? Nope, that's not going to be going anywhere.
So, well, Elijah, why don't you close this out in prayer and then
Why don't I?
Would you please?
Yeah.
thank you.
Father, we thank you so much for the Sabbath and for this time that you've allowed us to be together and to discuss your word. We ask that the things that we've read today would stick with us today and kind of circulate in our hearts and our minds, and that you would continue to give us understanding on these topics as we study them throughout the coming weeks. And that you would bless those who are able to watch with us online and be part of our family in that way, and that we would all have received that great blessing from sharing the word today. And ask for protection for the rest of the day and for rest, that you would be with us and help us to conform ourselves more to the image of your Son, and to do the best we can to occupy until your soon return. For this we ask and pray in the name of your Son. Amen.
Well, we want to thank you for joining us in our very little simple process here of having a study on God's Holy Sabbath. And we're glad you could join us, and we hope to see you again next time. Until then.